The pale morning light, thin and sterile as it filtered through the high north-facing window, fell across my hands. My fingers moved with a practiced, unhurried precision, a surgeon's deliberation applied to a far more delicate task. I was arranging the orchid petals on a heavy silver tray, each one a brittle, papery ghost of its former self. Their colors had faded from vibrant purples and whites to the gentle, complex browns of old parchment. I picked them up one by one, feeling their near weightlessness, hearing the faint, dry whisper as they shifted against each other, the sound of preserved time. My work was one of creation through decay, a careful choreography of the inevitable. I placed each desiccated petal in a concentric circle, forming a complex mandala of decay around a central point. The pattern was intricate, demanding absolute focus, the veins on each petal aligning with the next to create a web of exquisite ruin. At the very center of this floral necropolis sat a small, stark white porcelain bowl. I had filled it earlier with cold milk, its pure, opaque surface a placid and chilling contrast to the intricate death that surrounded it, a pool of stillness in a sea of forgotten life. Beside the bowl, I placed a small crystal dish. Into it, I poured a slow, viscous ribbon of dark buckwheat honey. It was nearly black, coiling upon itself as it filled the dish, its movement thick and deliberate, like lava cooling. The honey was not for sweetness, but for its preservative qualities, for its resemblance to ancient amber that entombs and holds things forever out of time. Its earthy musk rose to join the other scents in the room, a low, primal note in the funereal perfume that was beginning to accumulate in the still air. The air itself was a carefully curated element of this ritual. The sweet, cloying scent of the wilting orchids was the foundation, a constant reminder of beauty's fleeting nature. To this, I added the sharp, grounding scent of frankincense. A thin plume of its smoke rose from a brass burner in the corner of the room, its lazy gray tendrils weaving through the air, purifying the space while simultaneously layering it with ancient, ceremonial gravity. The combined aroma was heavy, almost suffocating, the smell of a forgotten chapel or a sealed tomb filled with offerings. When the last petal was in place and the honey had settled into a glossy, dark pool, I stepped back. The composition on the silver tray was complete, a perfect, silent tableau. It was a still life of decay and purity, a captured moment where beauty was not lost to decomposition, but was instead defined by it. There was a quiet hum of rightneck in the arrangement, an imposition of order upon the natural process of corruption. This was my sanctuary, the careful construction of a world where I controlled the narrative of endings, making them deliberate and beautiful. The shrill, digital shriek of the telephone was a violence. It tore through the sacred silence I had so carefully cultivated, a sound so alien and vulgar in this space that I flinched as if struck. My breath caught in my throat, and the quiet satisfaction of a moment before evaporated, replaced by a jarring, unwelcome intrusion. The phone lay on a side table, a black glass rectangle vibrating against the polished wood, its insistent summons a crude demand from the world outside my walls, a world I worked so diligently to keep at bay. My eyes found the screen, which glowed with an unwelcome familiarity. It was my sister's name, a name that, in itself, carried the chaotic energy of spontaneity and unpredictable emotion, everything that was antithetical to the ordered stillness of my life. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, my heart beating a frantic, resentful rhythm against my ribs. My thumb hovered over the screen, poised between the green icon of acceptance and the red icon of denial, a choice between preserving my sanctum for a few more moments or yielding to the inevitable pull of familial obligation. With a final, resigned exhalation, I surrendered. The soft slide of my thumb across the glass was the only movement in the room, but it felt like a tectonic shift. As the call connected, the carefully constructed silence shattered into a million pieces, the frequency of the outside world flooding in. My gaze drifted back to the silver tray, to the meticulously arranged petals and the cold milk. In an instant, my perfect composition of controlled decay seemed fragile and meaningless, a child's game exposed by the harsh light of reality. The stillness was gone, and something else was about to begin. She did not so much enter my house as she displaced the air within it. The front door opened and a gust of wind, carrying the smells of rain, wet pavement, and the electric hum of the city, rushed into the sterile quiet of my hallway. It was an elemental intrusion, a violation of the hermetically sealed atmosphere I so carefully maintained. She followed the wind in, her hair damp and disordered, a constellation of tiny raindrops glittering on the shoulders of her coat like captured stars. She was a whirlwind of vibrant, chaotic energy, and the very silence of the house seemed to recede from her presence. I watched her from the shadows of the adjoining room, a silent observer in my own home. She moved with an unconscious grace, a fluid ease that was entirely at odds with the rigid geometry of my living space. Her presence was not loud, but it was immense. The subtle sound of her breathing, the soft scuff of her shoes on the polished floorboards, filled the void that was usually occupied only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the whisper of dust motes in the light. She was not a guest. She was an occupation, a living, breathing entity that had taken root in my still world. Her curiosity was tactile. As she drifted through the rooms, her fingertips trailed along the surfaces of my possessions. They brushed against the cool, unforgiving marble of the mantelpiece, traced the gilded spine of a book I had not touched in years, and slid across the lacquered surface of a side table. Each touch felt like a transgression, a warm, living smudge on the pristine, cold surfaces of my life. I had curated my home as a museum of beautiful, untouchable things, and she was interacting with it as if it were a garden to be explored. She paused for a long time before the collection of butterflies mounted under glass. This was the heart of my sanctuary, a testament to beauty perfected and preserved by its own cessation. The iridescent blues, fiery oranges, and velvety blacks of their wings were frozen in eternal, silent flight, each specimen pinned with exacting precision. She leaned in close, her face near the glass, her expression one of soft, uncritical wonder. I saw her not as an admirer of my work, but as a living creature mourning its static, dead kin. Then she breathed. A small, almost imperceptible cloud of vapor bloomed on the cold glass surface, directly over the magnificent wings of a blue morpho. It was a fleeting blemish, a momentary stain of warm, moist life upon the sterile barrier separating the living from the preserved dead. The fog lingered for a second before fading, but the image of it was seared into my mind. It was an impurity, a reminder of the messy, unpredictable nature of existence that I had so painstakingly edited out of my own. As the afternoon waned, she found a patch of sunlight that had managed to pierce the gloom of my parlor. She curled up in an armchair, a book open in her lap, though she did not seem to be reading. The sunlight, so often a cold, analytical force in my home, seemed to soften and cling to her, illuminating the fine hairs on her arms and warming the color of her skin. Her stillness was utterly different from mine. Mine was a rigid, practiced control, while hers was a state of natural, effortless repose, like a cat sleeping in a sunbeam. Later, as twilight bled through the windows and filled the house with deep, ambiguous shadows, we passed each other in the narrow upper hallway. The space was barely wide enough for two people, forcing an intimacy I had not anticipated. I moved with my usual quiet efficiency, my body held in check, while she walked with a loose-limbed languor, her mind seemingly elsewhere. The air grew thick with a strange tension as the distance between us closed, the silence amplifying the sound of our nearly silent footsteps on the old wood. The contact, when it came, was accidental and electric. As we squeezed past one another, the back of her hand brushed against mine. It was a fleeting, insignificant moment, but the sensation was overwhelming. Her skin was a shock of heat against my own, which was always cool to the touch. It was not a gentle warmth, but a searing, living fire, a jolt of pure vitality that shot up my arm and seemed to strike a long dormant nerve deep within my chest. I recoiled instantly, snatching my hand back as if I had touched a hot stove. The motion was sharp, involuntary, a physical rejection of the unexpected stimulus. For a heartbeat, her eyes met mine, a flicker of surprise in their depths, before she offered a small, apologetic smile and continued on her way down the hall, oblivious to the profound disturbance she had caused. I remained frozen, my back pressed against the wall, listening to her footsteps fade away into the deepening shadows of the house. Long after she had disappeared into her room, the feeling lingered. I stood alone in the silent hallway, staring at the back of my own hand, which still burned with the phantom sensation of her touch. It was no longer my hand. It felt marked, branded, contaminated by an alien energy. The spot where our skin had met was a focal point of warmth that refused to dissipate. A tiny ember of chaotic life that had breached my defenses and now glowed threateningly in the cold, ordered fortress of my body. The house was submerged in the profound quiet of a moonless night, a silence that felt different now, heavier. It was no longer the empty, sterile silence of solitude, but a silence charged with a foreign presence, punctuated by the soft, even rhythm of another's breathing from the guest room down the hall. Sleep was a distant shore I could not reach, my mind a turbulent sea of unfamiliar sensations. I slipped out of my bed, the cool air raising goosebumps on my skin, and was drawn, as if by some unseen current, towards the glass walls of my conservatory. There, the air was thick and humid, a tropical atmosphere I had manufactured to nurture my collection of exotic and nocturnal flora. It clung to me, heavy with the complex perfumes of night-blooming jasmine and the damp, loamy scent of orchids. Moonlight, filtered through the high glass panes of the ceiling, was a spectral silver fluid that pooled on the stone floor, painting ethereal, shifting patterns across the broad leaves of the ferns and philodendrons. I stood in the center of this artificial jungle, a ghost in my own constructed Eden, feeling the usual sense of control begin to fray at the edges. I did not hear her approach. She simply materialized in the arched doorway, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the hallway. She was barefoot, clad only in a long, simple t-shirt that fell to her mid-thigh, obscuring the lines of her body and transforming her into a creature of shadow and suggestion. She did not speak, her silence a mirror of my own, and for a long moment we just existed in the same space, two silent figures in a moon-drenched room, the air between us humming with unspoken questions. She moved towards the center of the room, her bare feet making no sound on the cool stone. Her destination was the singular prize of my collection, a rare black orchid, its petals the color of a starless midnight sky, their texture like crushed velvet. It was a perfect specimen of cultivated darkness, a flower that thrived in the absence of light. She stopped before it, her head tilted in the same attitude of gentle curiosity I had seen earlier. Her finger, pale in the moonlight, reached out and grazed the edge of a petal with an almost reverent slowness. In that instant, a dam within me broke. I moved before I had consciously decided to, crossing the space between us in 2 silent strides. My hand covered hers, trapping her fingers against the velvety softness of the orchid petal. The contact was a detonation of warmth and texture, the impossible softness of the flower, the living heat of her skin, the coolness of my own. She did not pull away. She simply turned her head, her eyes finding mine in the gloom, wide and questioning. Slowly, deliberately, I turned her to face me. My other hand rose to cup her jaw, my thumb stroking the soft skin beneath her ear. The moonlight caught the moisture on her lips, making them gleam. They were slightly parted, an unconscious invitation that I was powerless to resist. I leaned in, surrendering to a gravitational pull that had been building since the moment she had breathed upon the glass. The first touch of our lips was hesitant, a soft exploratory pressure, a question asked and answered in the same breath. The kiss deepened, becoming a slow, languid exploration. Her taste was intoxicating, a clean, fresh flavor mingled with the heady, floral perfume of the conservatory. My hands slid from her face down the column of her neck to her waist, pulling her flush against me. I could feel the startling warmth of her body through the thin cotton of her shirt, the gentle give of her stomach against mine. Her arms, which had been hanging loosely at her sides, came up to encircle my neck, her fingers tangling in the hair at my nape. We sank to the floor without breaking the kiss, a slow, controlled descent onto the cool, smooth stone. The moonlight dappled our bodies through the leaves of the giant ferns, creating a shifting mosaic of light and shadow across our skin. The t-shirt she wore was an unwanted barrier, a final layer of separation that I dispensed with, my hands moving with a newfound urgent confidence. Her skin was even warmer than I had imagined, smooth and flawless under my palms, a canvas of pure, living heat. Lying there on the floor of my glass jungle, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, the carefully constructed walls of my world crumbled to dust. My hands, which had only known the brittle fragility of dead things, now learned the language of living flesh. They explored the gentle curve of her hip, the sharp line of her collarbone, the soft, yielding plane of her belly. Every touch was a revelation, a rediscovery of a world I had long ago abandoned for one of artifice and control. She responded with a quiet, breathy eagerness, her body arching into my touch, her hands tracing patterns on my back. We moved together in the pale, spectral light, a silent, primal dance of discovery. There was no thought, no analysis, only the overwhelming, instinctual reality of her body beneath mine. This was not a surrender, it was a reclamation. I was not losing control, but rather seizing a different kind of power, one that was raw, untamed, and terrifyingly, exquisitely alive. The morning light that filled my bedroom was sharp and unforgiving, stripping the shadows of their mystery, and leaving behind only the stark reality of the room. I awoke alone in the vast expanse of my bed, the sheets a tangled landscape of white linen. The space beside me was empty, but not cold. It held a residual warmth, a faint impression of another body. A profound silence had reclaimed the house, but it was a changed silence, no longer empty, but now pregnant with the memory of sound, of breath, of movement. I found her in the kitchen, bathed in the morning sun that streamed through the eastern windows. She was wearing my silk robe, the dark emerald fabric a startling splash of color against the monochromatic severity of the room. It was far too large for her, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the sash tied loosely at her waist. She held a coffee mug in both hands, bringing it to her lips with a slow, deliberate grace, her gaze lost somewhere in the garden beyond the glass. The air was filled with the rich, grounding aroma of freshly brewed coffee. She turned as I entered, her movement fluid and unhurried. Her eyes met mine, and in their clear, calm depths, I found no trace of awkwardness or regret, none of the usual morning-after anxieties. There was only a quiet, unnerving curiosity, a placid watchfulness that made me feel like the subject of a beautiful, inscrutable study. She offered a small, knowing smile that did not quite reach her eyes, a gesture of shared intimacy that was both a comfort and a profound disruption to my equilibrium. We did not leave the house. The world outside ceased to exist, its demands and rhythms fading into an irrelevant hum beyond the walls of our self-contained universe. The day unfolded in a slow, languid rhythm, a silent conversation spoken entirely through touch and proximity. Time itself seemed to bend and warp, hours stretching and compressing, marked only by the shifting angle of the sun as it tracked across the sky, casting long, moving shadows across the polished floors. Every touch was a new cartography, a mapping of previously unknown territory. My hands, so accustomed to the precise and lifeless forms of my collections, now became instruments of discovery. I traced the constellation of faint freckles across her shoulders, the delicate bird-like bones of her wrists, the astonishing softness of the skin on her inner thigh. It was an act of intense, almost academic focus, an obsession with the texture, temperature, and topography of her living form. I laid her back against the cool, crisp sheets of my bed, the afternoon light turning the room into a golden, hazy sanctuary. From the nightstand, I took a small, dark glass bottle of jasmine oil. I warmed a few drops between my palms, the intensely sweet, narcotic fragrance blooming in the air, thick and intoxicating. Her eyes followed my movements, heavy-lidded and trusting, her body pliant and open under my gaze. The oil made her skin gleam, transforming it into a living sculpture of light and shadow. I began at her feet, my thumbs pressing into the arches, my movements slow and methodical, a ritual of anointment. I worked my way up her legs, her thighs, feeling the long, lean muscles yield under my touch. This was not an act of seduction in the conventional sense. It was an act of preservation, an attempt to commit every detail of her to memory, to absorb her vitality through my fingertips. My lips followed the path my hands had made, tasting the salt of her skin mingled with the floral sweetness of the jasmine. I kissed the hollow of her throat, the sensitive skin behind her ear, the curve of her hip. I was not just exploring her body, but consuming it, memorizing it with a desperate, reverent hunger. She responded with soft, involuntary sighs, her breath catching in her throat, her fingers clenching and unclenching in the sheets. The light in the room deepened from gold to a warm, burnished amber as the afternoon began to fade. Our bodies moved together in a slow, hypnotic dance, a silent rhythm that was as natural and inevitable as breathing. There was no thought, no planning, only a pure, instinctual flow of sensation. It was a complete surrender to the physical, a submersion in the textures, scents, and tastes of the present moment, a world contained entirely within the four walls of the room. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, her head resting on my shoulder, her leg thrown over mine. The silence that settled over us was comfortable, complete. I stared at the ceiling, watching the last of the daylight paint shifting patterns on the white plaster, my mind strangely blank. My usual compulsion to analyze, to categorize, to control had been silenced. There was only the weight of her body against mine, the sound of her steady breathing in my ear, and the overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful simplicity of the moment. The normal progression of time dissolved entirely, its linear, regulated march replaced by a thick, viscous flow of moments that bled one into the next. Hours became meaningless units, irrelevant to the new reality contained within the walls of my house. Our existence was measured not by the ticking of the clock, but by the cycles of shared meals, the shifting of light across a room, and the deepening intimacy of our silent communion. We were adrift in a temporal bubble of our own making, a world apart from the one that continued its frantic pace just beyond the front door. My sister's phone, which had been abandoned on the console table in the entryway, served as the sole unwelcome emissary from that other world. Several times, its insistent, vibrating buzz would disrupt the profound quiet, a frantic, insect-like sound against the polished wood. We both heard it. It summons a sharp intrusion into our sanctuary, but we both ignored it. It was a relic from a life that no longer seemed to belong to either of us, a hollow echo from a distant shore we had left far behind. My focus narrowed until she was the only thing in my perceptual field. Everything else, my routines, my collections, my carefully ordered thoughts, faded into a peripheral blur. I became a meticulous observer of her every subtle action. I watched the way her brow furrowed slightly when she concentrated on a page in a book, the unconscious grace with which she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the precise manner in which she held a water glass, her fingers long and delicate against the crystal. Each small, mundane detail became a point of intense fascination, a piece of a magnificent living puzzle I was compelled to solve. The desire that had initially sparked between us began to transmute into something deeper and more unsettling. It was no longer just a physical wanting, but a kind of obsessive absorption, a yearning that went beyond the flesh. I felt a growing need not just to touch her, but to understand the very essence of her vitality, to possess the intangible quality that made her so vibrantly alive. It was a collector's impulse turned inward, a connoisseur's gaze directed at a living masterpiece, and I felt an unnerving urge to capture and preserve it. As evening began to cast its long, deep shadows through the house, I began my preparations. A new ritual was forming, born from this strange and powerful obsession. I went to the large, freestanding tub that occupied the center of my master bathroom, a stark white basin of modern porcelain. Turning the heavy chrome taps, I let the hot water rush in, the steam rising in thick, billowing clouds that softened the room's hard edges and stilled the air with a clean, mineral scent. The preparations were deliberate, each step performed with the same focused intensity as my floral arrangements. From the linen closet, I retrieved several large ceramic pitchers. I had filled them earlier not with water, but with whole milk, cool and rich from the refrigerator. One by one, I poured the milk into the steaming water, watching as the clear liquid swirled and then transformed, becoming an opaque, pearlescent white, as smooth and impenetrable as polished marble. The bath was no longer a bath. It had become an offering. For the final element, I went to the conservatory, my shears in hand. I moved past the jasmine and the ferns to my prized orchids, a black and the white varieties. With a steady hand, I cut the newest, most perfect blossoms from their stems, their life's purpose now redirected to mine. Returning to the bathroom, I scattered the petals across the surface of the milky water. The stark black and pristine white blooms floated on the surface, a drifting monochromatic mosaic, a perfect, beautiful skin upon the still white depths. She appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the running water and the heavy floral scent that now filled the hall. She was wrapped in my silk robe again, her hair still slightly damp from an earlier shower. A slow, languid smile spread across her face as she took in the scene. The steaming milk-white water, the floating petals, the soft candlelight I had just lit. In her eyes, I saw pure, unadulterated pleasure and anticipation. The blissful ignorance of a beautiful creature about to step into a perfectly prepared work of art. With a silent gesture, I beckoned her forward, my hand extended. She took it without hesitation, her fingers lacing through mine, her skin a familiar, reassuring heat against my own. I led her to the edge of the tub, the steam swirling around our ankles like a low-lying mist. The sight was intoxicating, the pristine, milky surface, the stark beauty of the black and white petals adrift like fallen stars on a placid, moon-white sea. Her eyes were wide with a kind of dreamlike wonder, completely captivated by the romantic, decadent scene I had so carefully orchestrated for her. We slipped into the water together, the submersion a slow, sensual descent into warmth and weightlessness. The milky water enveloped us, its touch like warm silk against the skin, obscuring our bodies from view and reducing us to pale shapes moving in a white void. The orchid petals clung to our wet shoulders and arms, fragile, beautiful blemishes on our skin. The sensory experience was overwhelming and acute. The oppressive warmth of the water, the slick, smooth caress of the milk, and the intoxicating, almost funereal perfume of the orchids blooming in the steam. In that white, dimensionless space, our bodies found each other again. It was a culmination of the previous days, a final, complete dissolution of boundaries, our limbs intertwined beneath the milky surface in a slow, languid tangle, our movements fluid and hypnotic. It felt like the ultimate act of intimacy, a merging not just of bodies but of essences, as if the opaque water were breaking us down to our component parts and blending us into a single new entity. There was no thought, only a profound, overwhelming sense of connection, a silent, shared climax of sensation. Afterward, she lay back, her body utterly boneless and relaxed, her head resting against the cool porcelain curve of the tub. Her eyes were closed, a blissful, serene smile gracing her lips, her dark hair fanned out in the white water around her head like a halo. She was a perfect image of post-coital repose, a pre-Raphaelite vision of languid, sensual surrender. Seeing her so perfectly still, so exquisitely vulnerable, I felt a switch flip within my mind, the artist's cold ambition eclipsing the lover's warmth. I extracted myself from the water with a stealthy, practiced silence, the water barely rippling to mark my exit. My movements were now imbued with a different kind of purpose, a sharp, clinical focus. From behind a tall, decorative screen in the corner of the room, I wheeled out the instrument I had prepared earlier, a large-format vintage plate camera on a heavy wooden tripod. Its brass lens, large and unblinking, gleamed in the candlelight like the single, predatory eye of a cyclops. The transition was complete, The participant had become the observer. The lover had become the artist. I positioned the tripod, adjusted the focus, and inserted the glass plate, my hands steady and sure. The sharp, acrid smell of the magnesium flash powder filled my nostrils as I primed the flash pan. The sudden, violent eruption of brilliant white light was an assault on the soft, candlelit ambiance of the room. A brutal, instantaneous flash that bleached the world of color and shadow. Her eyes flew open in a spasm of shock, her body jolting in the water. The serene, blissful expression was gone, replaced in an instant by a wide-eyed confusion that was rapidly curdling into fear. The face she saw looking back at her from behind the camera was not the one she knew. The tenderness, the passion, the quiet adoration, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind a mask of cold, detached, almost ravenous focus. It was the face of a collector regarding a prize specimen, an artist staring at a perfect final composition. The warmth between us had not just cooled, it had flash frozen, and in my gaze she saw not a lover, but a predator. Her understanding was instantaneous and absolute, a silent, horrifying epiphany. With a strangled cry, she scrambled out of the tub, her movements clumsy and desperate. She slipped on the wet tile, her limbs flailing as she grabbed my silk robe and pulled it around her trembling, milk-streaked body. Without a single backward glance, she fled, a frantic, panicked flight from the room, down the hall, and out the front door, which she left gaping open behind her. She left a trail of milky, petal-strewn water on the floor, a chaotic, messy path of her escape. I did not move. I simply stood in the steam-filled room, listening to the sound of her bare feet slapping against the pavement outside until it was swallowed by the silence of the night. My gaze dropped to the camera, and I felt a cold, clean, and perfect sense of triumph. The image was captured. The moment was mine.